Good afternoon and welcome everyone. If you just joined us, I'm Michelle Boardman, the Director of Social Marketing for the TA Network, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this afternoon's webinar. This webinar is a part of the social marketing learning community that just started, and it's facilitated by Michael Collado from Youth Move and I, and we hold these meetings monthly. And they're designed to support those who are undertaking social marketing work. That could be in communities, states, tribes, territories, and includes both those with and without federal grants. We try really hard to address topics that are meaningful to you in your work, and we welcome your suggestions to future topics. So please do let us know in the chat box if there's something that you'd love to see a webinar on. Today's webinar is the third in a series of 4. And if you missed the first 1 or 2, no worries. They are posted online, and we will send you a link to them. But also our speaker today will give us a brief overview of framing and its importance in social marketing before taking a dive into the content for today's webinar. And we'd love for this session to be interactive, so we hope that you will add comments and questions along the way. And there's a chat box on your screen to engage. Please use below the chat box, you'll see a spot to download the slides for today's presentation. And we'll send a follow-up email with a link to the webinar. So you'll have both the slides and the recording as well. At the end of the webinar, there will be a brief survey that pops up. So we hope that you'll stay with us just a second longer after the webinar ends to do a survey. And that's also a great place to let us know how we could improve these sessions and what you'd like to see more of. And the last webinar in this series will be held on June 4th. So please hold that date and join us again. So we have 2 wonderful speakers today, Jess and Rose, who are both joining us from the Frameworks Institute. And Frameworks is a research and communications firm in DC, and they really take a deep dive into the subject matter in a particular area in order to understand what a broad public thinks about a particular area, like children's behavioral health, and how we can go about reframing our messaging in order to change perception or behavior, reduce stigma, and broaden awareness of our work. So the second webinar was really talking specifically about children's behavioral health, and this webinar will be a bit more about the systems that we work in and how to speak about these complex systems in a way that makes sense to the uninitiated. So with that, I will turn it over to Rose and Jess, and you can take it away.
Thanks for the intro, Michelle. You offered a great synopsis on Frameworks and what we do. I feel like that's not easy to do. My mom keeps asking me, what is it you do again? She's trying to explain to her friends and neighbors, but you gave a great kind of overview of our mission and methods. So this is Jess speaking at the moment, and I'm really excited that we are joined by a member of our research team. Rose Hendricks is here. You want to say hi, Rose?
Hi, everyone. This is Rose.
Rose is a cognitive scientist, and she has particular expertise in metaphors and how we use metaphor and language, how metaphors influence our thinking, our understanding. So we're lucky to have her with us, and we're going to talk about metaphors specifically a little bit later in this webinar. I want to just start with our learning objectives, so make sure we all kind of know what the goal is today. So the focus for today it's on storytelling, first of all. Telling stories that are effective at building the public understanding about the issues that you're all working in, the way Michelle described. And the particular goal today is to tell stories that bring more of the system into view. So it's really tempting to tell stories about individuals who are affected by social issues, and it can be really challenging to figure out how to tell those same stories, but in a way that highlights the important context around those individuals. But there are ways to do that. We have some strategies to offer up, and that's what we're going to share with you today. So it isn't we're not focused on a specific social issue today. We're focused on kind of widening the lens storytelling strategies more generally, but we are going to pull from tools that we've developed through our research on two issues in particular. So we're going to talk about a tool that we developed for communicators who are talking about child development, and then we're going to talk about a second tool that we developed through our research on adolescent substance use and abuse, use and misuse. So we'll touch a little bit on those two topics. And then, as always, we're going to have a Q&A session at the end. Feel free to, if you kind of need a point of clarification as we go along, feel free to type those in the chat box. There will be opportunities for interaction the way Michelle described, but if you have kind of bigger discussion questions, or maybe you want to throw at us some ideas of your own challenges in your own communications that are related to what we're talking about and want to get into a bit more discussion about those, we'll have time at the end for that kind of thing. So let's talk about storytelling. And where we're going to start is the place that I just mentioned, which is there's kind of a typical way that we as social issue advocates that we tend to tell stories. In part, we do it because we want to tell stories that are compelling. We tell them sometimes because as practitioners or service providers, you all are working with individuals and thinking about their particular challenges and experiences and sometimes wanting to elevate their voices especially. But it means oftentimes we tell stories that are focused on individuals and also stories that kind of follow the same sort of trajectory. Stories that all have a similar shape, even though they're about different people and different issues. So I'm going to actually turn it over to Kurt Vonnegut to describe what that typical shape of a story looks like. Here's a little video clip for you.
Well, there's no reason why the simple shapes of story can't be fed into computers. They are beautiful shapes. This is the GI axis, good fortune, ill fortune. Sickness and poverty down here, wealth and boisterous good health up there. Here's the very middle. Now, this is the BE axis. B stands for beginning. E stands for electricity. Now, this is an exercise in relativity, really. The shape of the curves is what matters and not their origins. So we'll start a little above average. Is why get a depressing person? We'll start the whole thing. We call this story Man in Hole, but it needn't be about a man, and it needn't be about somebody getting into a hole. But it's just a good way to remember it. Somebody gets into trouble, gets out of it again. People love that story. They never get sick of it.
Okay, so this is what we call the man in the hole story because we borrow that phrase from Kurt Vonnegut. But that shape of the story I'm guessing may sound familiar to lots of you. And it reflects how lots of social issue advocates tell the stories that we want to tell to a public audience. That's what we're focused on in this webinar, is talking to a public audience, telling stories that we hope will raise awareness about the issue that we're focused on. And we often rely on this model, which is in part because it's a familiar one. We sort of, the public knows what to expect and is kind of comforted by that recognizable pattern. So we rely on that shape of stories quite a bit. So here is what that shape of a story looks like when it's applied to a social issue. And what I'm going to show you next is another video clip, and it comes from a public awareness campaign, and see if you can identify for yourself how it kind of follows that same man in a hole shape of a story.
This is Jeremy Estrada. He's 20 years old.
My mother used drugs. My father disappeared. Got this when I was 9, when I joined a gang. By the time I was 12, I I get so angry, I just go out and beat people up. I've been stabbed, I've been shot, I've been as bad as they get. But in 1992, my probation officer convinced the judge not to send me to prison. Instead, I was sent to a program called Rite of Passage. It was tough. 6 months of conditioning in the desert, then school 8 hours a day, then working with handicapped children. I learned right from wrong. I learned how to learn. I graduated from high school and community college. I was student body president. Today I have a scholarship to a university, and I plan to go to medical school. I was lucky, but too many kids like me wind up in jail because we don't invest in programs that work. Believe me, I'm a new man. I might still cut you open one day, but now it'll be to take out your appendix.
Okay, so that's a man in a whole story. In this case, the man is Jeremy, and the hole is he got into violence and joined a gang when he was young, but he climbed out of that hole. This is how this story is resolved. You can see even in the camera work, there's a kind of a zooming in on Jeremy as an individual. Sometimes all we see is his facial expression, and he's talking from his personal experience about what he struggled with and what he was able to do, how he was able to overcome the odds and make something really amazing of his life. So we don't see a lot of the social context there, but it's a compelling man in a whole story. We learn about Jeremy, what he experienced, what he kind of went through. Here's a different example. As Kurt Vonnegut says, the man in a whole story needn't be about a man, it needn't be about a whole. In this case, this is a familiar story to all of us. We know the story of Rosa Parks, and it's an incredible story. She is an inspiring person. Her story is one that we all kind of draw inspiration from. It's one that we retell with a lot of admiration and pride. And it's a man in a whole story in the sense that she was struggling. She was part of some really difficult circumstances, and that she did something pretty incredible. She climbed out of that hole. She was brave, and with this single act of refusing to give up her seat on a bus, she kind of opened the door to lots of other points of social progress, for things to kind of turn around, and for lots of good to come of her story and her experience. So here's the challenge. We're talking about this kind of typical way in which we tell stories. And here's the challenge in telling them the way that we do is that we're missing the context. We're missing other parts of the story. So for example, if we think about this story of Rosa Parks, everything I said about her as an individual and her experience and her heroism stands. All of that is absolutely true. But she didn't operate alone. She didn't work in a vacuum. In fact, she was part of a social movement. She was acting alongside many, many, many other people who also were courageous, also were fighting for justice, also did lots of amazing things. And the collective action, the commitment of all of these folks as a group is missed if we tell Rosa Parks' story without including some of that context. So even like the movement itself, they had really sophisticated strategies for creating phone trees and rehearsing for civil disobedience acts that they were planning. There was so much about Rosa Parks' story and about this period in our collective history that we need to understand from a systems perspective. And the reason that's important is because if we think about Rosa Parks as someone who stands out from the crowd, who is a hero, it's hard for the rest of us to identify with that. We admire her and recognize her and are inspired by her, but we might also be inclined to feel like, well, we can't all be Rosa Parks. What we want to do, though, if we're working towards social change, is we want to all be able to see how we can be engaged, see how there's a role for each of us. It's a lot easier to think about how we can kind of contribute, we can be part of social change without feeling like we have to be a hero at that level. So the kind of lesson from this is where we know telling stories is important. We know we always want to tell a story because that's compelling, that resonates with folks. We've talked on previous webinars about how we think in story. It's kind of a defining feature of us as humans. But in order to be strategic communicators, we need to recognize that we can't just tell a story. We have to think about what kind of story we're telling specifically, and in particular, what the story that we're telling will do. How will it influence public thinking? How might it change attitudes? How might it engage folks in a social issue versus make them feel like outsiders to that issue? So stories do jobs. When we're telling stories, the way that we're telling them has massive implications. And what the research that we do at Frameworks is in part about doing empirical analysis to be able to determine what the impacts of different stories is, so that you all as communicators can make strategic choices in how you tell your stories to bring about the kind of change that you're working for. When we talk about stories that work, at Frameworks we have 3 goals in particular. So we're interested in stories that have the potential to enhance public knowledge about a social issue, shift attitudes, so shift attitudes away from, for example, harmful stereotypes or kind of negative disengagement towards more productive attitudes about, for example, collective efficacy, or the feeling that, we can solve problems, or we can work together to make things better. And then the third thing is we're interested in stories that can help build policy support. And I use the word policy with a little p here. So sometimes policy change takes the form of legislation, but it also, every restaurant has a set of policies. Every school board has policies. Sometimes policy just means kind of standard practices across a particular community, but we're interested in stories that can bring about that kind of change, actual material change that improves people's lives. And stories can do this in lots of different ways. So stories can make change in how they present the problem. Here's one example. So if we were to think about the issue of obesity, we can think about the problem as stemming from when folks, eat too much junk food, or spend too much time sitting on the couch, or don't get enough exercise. We can talk about individual experiences of obesity and the kinds of maybe medical challenges that people who are overweight face. But if we present the problem differently, if we think instead about the context that surrounds this issue of obesity, so for example, things like where fresh produce is readily available versus where there are food deserts. Or if we think about agricultural practices, if we think about which types of crops receive subsidies from the government, these are certainly things that factor into this issue, the social issue of obesity, and they're also things that influence individual decision-making and individual behaviors. So telling the story in a way that brings in these decision-making contexts is a really helpful tool for building understanding about that issue. It also kind of pulls blame away from individuals who are most directly affected by the issue, and avoids victim blaming in that sense. So the other way stories can make changes in how they offer solutions. This is equally, if not more important. Solutions are the key to social change. So as another example, we could say we're talking about the issue of climate change. We could focus on individual behaviors and offer the advice that everyone should ride their bikes more and take public transportation more. And of course that's important. That's not an incorrect way to think about the issue. But if we tell that same story in a different way, in a way that brings in context, we might, for example, encourage thinking about creating a more robust network of cycle paths within an area. Maybe we'll think about how we can make it safer for people who do ride bikes by widening bike lanes or increasing the number of bike lanes. Maybe we can produce maps that help people seek out routes between the different places that they need to go. Maybe we think about the cost of public transportation and the accessibility in various areas. So these are things that are structural, that are that represent the context in which individuals make choices and live out their own personal lives. But we often, as advocates, we often focus on individuals because we care about individuals and tend to neglect those contexts, which actually have the potential to build greater understanding about why individuals do the things that they do. We're constrained and alternatively facilitated to act in various ways, depending on where we live and what's available to us. So the goal for today is to think about telling a different kind of story. So moving from the sort of man in a hole story that Kurt Vonnegut described to a story about a system, what we call a how it works story, a story that kind of zooms out, brings in more of the landscape, helps folks see different players, different actors that are relevant, and also kind of sheds a light on different processes at work. So where are there kind of cause-effect relationships? Where are there processes that are playing out that we can interrupt, that we can kind of catch, especially if we're talking about something like prevention? How can we collectively change the system to avoid getting to a place where individuals are negatively affected at all? All right, what I'm going to show you now is two examples from the same story. In this case, the issue that is being portrayed has to do with homelessness. And I've actually pulled two different clips from the same video that was produced. So one of these clips is, I would say, reflects a sort of a man in a hole story. And then the second clip that I'll show you widens the lens. It's talking about the very same issue, homelessness in Marin County, but it widens the lens to help us see how this issue works, how we're all kind of involved, how multiple systems, multiple support systems, that is, multiple structures and institutions kind of play into either perpetuating homelessness as a social issue or disrupting those processes and helping to bring about a different result. So let's look at maybe I won't specify which is first. I think it will be pretty obvious. Here's the first clip.
He was living a minute-to-minute existence. He would sleep wherever he felt tired. He had about a 6-block radius that he would travel. He would find food and eat whatever he found. He was diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic, and this disease just turned him into a different person. It was heartbreaking to watch him refuse help because of his untreated mental illness.
Okay, that was the first video clip, and I'm just going to go right into the second one.
This is where I used to live, right here. I was chronically homeless, been homeless for years. I felt like I'd been thrown away by society.
I felt that I'd really, really screwed up in life, and this is my punishment.
I just didn't know how I was going to get from point A to point B. The gap was enormous that needed to be bridged, and I couldn't do it on my own.
I went by myself and I was praying and just saying it over and over again. I can't do this anymore. I can't do this anymore. God help me.
The challenge of homelessness is in every community in our nation, unfortunately, especially in more affluent areas like the Bay Area.
Watch a lot of people pass away. People find, they get found in their tent dead from whatever reasons, illness, usually 100% in the cause, but causity on this varies.
I've been doing this job for 5 years, and when I started, it was difficult to coordinate care from the different agencies and from the county because we weren't talking to each other.
With whole person care, we're able to really address the issues that each person has, person by person, issue by issue, barrier by barrier.
Most importantly in that is those two words, whole person. We're able to now help somebody with their housing. We're able to help them with their health care. We're able to help them with their behavioral health needs. We can help them with their social needs, help them to get income. We can do all of that with one team.
I think that partnership is important because no one organization can do this alone.
Okay, hopefully you figured out that the first clip was kind of reflected that man in a whole story. And the second clip really zoomed out and showed much more of the context. I want to get your thoughts, though, and you can use the chat box for this. Rose is here monitoring, and we can have a bit of discussion. But you tell me, what was it that you saw in that second video clip? See if you can really identify and put your finger on which aspects of the bigger picture. What were the pieces of context that the public learns about through that second video clip that were missing from the first, that just aren't explained at all or even shown in that man in a whole clip? So think for a minute and then write your observations, write what you identified as being included in the second story, but not the first. Write those in the chat box, and then we'll discuss in a minute. Okay, it looks like we're getting some great comments coming in. Rose, would you want to read some of them and see what people came up with?
Sure, yeah, there's a lot of related but different ones here. So we've got talk about solutions in the second clip, and also, solutions relating or coming out of systems coordination, more obvious complexity in the second, which maybe has the effect of the next idea, which is less blame on individuals in the second. Along the lines of the solutions, we've got someone mention there are resources available, whereas, related to the solutions, then another thing in the second clip is there's an actual phase to the story and explain to the viewer how collaboration and helping the whole person can work. So another way of kind of getting at those solutions, which might have taken the form, someone else here mentioned teamwork across disciplines and coordination of different strategies, and then yet another kind of comment here about the solution sort of orientation in the second one, which seems like kind of a lot of things stemming off of the fact that there were solutions and kind of maybe how those solutions work, what they look like.
Yeah, you guys came up with great stuff. That's an excellent list. And everything you're naming is exactly what makes that second clip so much more effective. More effective in terms of those three things, those kind of three goals we identified. So building public understanding, shifting attitudes, and building support for policy change. I mean, now we even know what change could look like. We know who the service providers are. We know which professionals are working on this issue and have something to offer. That's amazing. Great, excellent list, and you all get it. This is awesome. Okay, moving on. I snuck in a little slide. I'm a sociologist by training, and so this is your mini sociology lesson. I would guess actually that several of you on the call have some kind of sociology background because there's this connection to the School of Social Work. So as C. Wright Mills describes, there's a difference between troubles and issues. Troubles describe what an individual goes through, and often it's thought to reflect on that individual's character. So, you know, an individual loses their job, that's a particular trouble that they're suffering from. But issues are different because issues transcend individuals and transcend local environments. Issues are things we share. They are reflections of how we are living, how we're organized as a society. So whereas losing a job is an individual trouble, underemployment is a social issue. And those two things are obviously really related, but we're seeing much more of the picture when we're focused on issues. So one of the advantages of telling stories in these new ways, and a how it works kind of a way, as opposed to a man in a hole kind of a way, is that we're able to see individual troubles as social issues. We're able to sort of all see ourselves in them and see how we have a responsibility to take an interest in them and to be part of resolving them, to be part of creating social change in which those challenges are alleviated. So as a general kind of practice here, think about pushing back. When you're telling stories about social issues, think about kind of pushing back on those cues in your language that focus on the individual, focus on those particular groups that are specifically affected by an issue, and instead pull forward those cues that help us think about the community as a whole, think about how we all are part of the systems that have allowed these social issues to crop up. And also that focus on solutions that you mentioned is really critical. So pulling forward cues that help us think about how we all can work together to address the challenges that we face. So we're going to switch it up a little bit, take a bit of a brain break. I want you to set aside what the sort of shapes of stories that we were just talking about, and we're just going to do a creative brainstorm exercise. So for those of you who have creative outlets, this will be very comfortable. For those of you who are kind of, is it the right brain that's more math and science? I always forget, left or right.
Think it's
For those of you who are more kind of, who like math and technology and kind of order and maybe don't like when things are super messy, this will be a bit more of a challenge, but give it your best shot. Here's what we're going to do. I put up this image, and I'm asking you to think about the idea of boiling over. So because we're just getting creative here, getting the juices flowing, there are no wrong answers. There's no incorrect way to participate. But what I want you to think about is what comes to mind when you think about this concept. When you think about the idea of boiling over, and you can look at the icon up on the screen for a bit more inspiration. But what associations do you have with that? And what is it that pops into your head? So what I'd like you to do is think for a minute and then type whatever it is that you come up with into the chat box. And in the interest of helping you get those juices flowing and kind of widen the possibilities of what you're able to come up with, think about nouns. So maybe you're thinking about a pot, a kettle, a stove, flames. Think about verbs, adjectives, synonyms and antonyms. So is there something that's the opposite of boiling over? Is that kind of, does it make you think of things that are somehow really different from that or in contrast to that? And then think about, your own icons, your own kind of imagery, visuals that come to mind in thinking about this concept. So I'll explain in a minute why we're doing this, but for the moment, no holds barred. Just go for it. See what comes to mind when you think about this concept and get creative. Okay, this is great. We've got some stuff coming in, and Rose, tell us what they came up with.
There's lots of stuff here. So you've got frustration and things becoming too much, distracted, uncontrolled, overwhelmed, hot, then urgency, unbearable, irritated. More things about heat here and steam and bubbles. Food on the stove is done. And then we've got another saying, a watched pot never boils. Then there's other ideas of busting loose or overwhelming. Well, there's another one. Oh, someone needs to turn down the heat with an exclamation point there.
That's good. I like it. Great. That's terrific. Okay, lots to work with there. Awesome. So you did a fabulous job. We are going to revisit that kind of brainstorm, that pool of ideas that you came up with in just a minute. We're going to get there by way of a reminder of what we focused on the last two webinars, though. So one of the biggest challenges for communicators is the fact that we don't get a blank slate, right? So we're storytellers, but when we set out to tell our stories, there are a whole lot of other folks telling stories too. And it's also true that we all kind of, because we have a lifetime of experiences and we have stories that live in our heads. We have stories that help us make sense of the world that we've developed over time. All of these stories, what we're referring to as stories in progress, represent challenges for communicators who have a particular story that they're wanting to deliver to the public, which they hope will be interpreted in a particular way. The stories in progress that I'm talking about, we at Frameworks, we refer to them as cultural models. The reason for that is we're interested in the ones that are kind of shared across the culture, the stories that we all sort of share, that we hear in movies and in novels and that kind of get told over and over again in lots of different ways and that will feel familiar to all of us. And that we all have available and that we are all, at least in some situations, likely to kind of draw on to make sense of new information that's given to us. So cultural models are these stories in progress, these assumptions or beliefs created through experience. I say they're taken for granted and largely automatic because they're not necessarily explicit stories. They're not even stories that we are thinking about telling ourselves most of the time. They're implicit stories that we draw on, like I said. They're almost more kind of latent stories. They're models of reasoning, patterns of reasoning that we all can use, but that we aren't necessarily aware of using when we do that. And yeah, so they're shared across the culture, and we use these stories to make meaning in particular of new experiences when we encounter them. It's actually, sometimes we think of them as shortcuts because it means we don't have to kind of make sense of a new experience completely from scratch and learn about every little aspect of it. We can draw on what we already know, what we already understand to incorporate new information. But these stories in progress do present challenges for communicators, in part for communicators who want to help the public think in new ways. In those cases, the existing stories can sometimes present certain obstacles. That's not always the case. It's not always that stories in progress are hindrances. In fact, sometimes the stories in progress are really helpful, and we want to actually cue them up and encourage members of the public to think through this issue in relation to that story, that familiar story. But being able to make strategic choices about which stories are helpful and which ones are not is a really valuable skill for communicators to be able to have. So we're going to think now about a specific social issue. That's the issue of adolescent substance use. And we've talked in previous webinars about how for every issue there's a whole ecosystem of different stories in progress, of different cultural models that the public relies on to kind of make sense of that issue. I'm not going to do a thorough tour of the swamp, of this ecosystem. You can think of it like a swamp or a jungle or some kind of complex ecosystem that is both messy but also really fruitful and productive. There's just a lot going on in there, a lot to navigate. We're not going to do a full tour, but I'm going to give you just kind of an overview. I'll walk you through a couple of the most dominant stories that we tell ourselves when we're non-experts on the issue of adolescent substance use and asked to think about this issue. So the first thing is that there's a dominant story that adolescence is inherently risky. So, teens have poor judgment. They're inclined to kind of take big risks, and that's just part of the nature of it. We're not going to change that. That's always how adolescence has been. It's how it always will be. That's a dominant story that that is told within the American public. It also means when we're thinking about adolescent substance use specifically, there's kind of a naturalizing or a normalizing of the idea that experimentation is natural. Taking risks, including with substances, is something that most teenagers do. That's kind of accepted by the public. In thinking about why adolescents might experiment with substance use, most of the time it's attributed to social pressure, to peer pressure, or alternatively to adolescents needing an escape from their stressful lives. What's kind of missing here is while the public recognizes the role of peer pressure and the sort of need to escape, there's not a lot of understanding. There aren't really dominant stories being told about what those social pressures are or why escape is needed, and in particular what the kind of social context is in which those pressures arise. So the idea of functional threshold refers to the fact that adolescent substance use, and I should specify here that in particular in relation to thinking about alcohol and marijuana, there are different stories that are being told for drugs like heroin and cocaine, but if we're thinking about marijuana and alcohol, there's kind of a sense among the public that, you know, teenagers are going to experiment with these things, and that actually that's just part of being a teenager. And it's not really a problem that we need to do anything about or address until it reaches the point of manifesting in negative outcomes. So if it leads to a teenager's decline in grades, for example, at that point there's recognition that it's an issue. Or if it's linked to, for example, unsafe sex, there's recognition within the public that at that point adolescent substance use is problematic. But generally speaking, until there are negative outcomes like that, it's kind of seen to be an accepted, risky, but an accepted and kind of normalized practice. And then in terms of thinking about what can be done to address the issue of adolescent substance use, because it's largely attributed to teens kind of being reckless and exercising bad judgment, because that's sort of how teens are, the solutions that folks reach for, that members of the public kind of reach for as the answer, ways to decrease substance use, is just to scare them straight. So we had folks in our interview say things like, well, we just need to get our teens to talk to someone who's in prison, who's doing time, and that'll teach them, you know, how they can't afford to let that happen to them. Or bring them to the morgue so they see the severity of kind of the worst case scenario of what substance use can lead to. So obviously this is a limited subset of available solutions, and in particular they're focused on addressing individual decision-making, individual behavior change, individual accountability. So, oops, I hit the button twice there. So the framing task here, and remember that what we're focused on is widening the lens, so bringing more of the system into view. The framing task here is to build public understanding about social conditions that can either prevent adolescent substance use or that can be drawn on, that can be strengthened to offer interventions in cases where there already is adolescent substance use. And in particular, we're focused on interventions that alleviate the harms that are associated with substance use. That is the framing task. The framing tool, in this case, is a very specific linguistic tool. And actually, maybe I'll let Rose explain this, because she's the expert on metaphor here. So do you want to talk to us about an explanatory metaphor as a framing tool?
Yeah, and even just thinking about the task that Jess just sort of brought up, that the idea is to sort of reframe social conditions. And social conditions are incredibly abstract. We cannot really see them. We might be able to see some pieces or some hints or symptoms, but we can't see them. We can't touch them. So that makes them really hard for us to wrap our heads around. But what a metaphor can do is to connect that abstract idea to something that's a lot more familiar, something preferably that we can see or touch or have recollection of experiencing ourselves, in order to help people bring that more complex topic in and to really understand it more deeply and accurately.
Great, thanks, Rose. Sure. So that is exactly what we have here, an explanatory metaphor, and we have a specific one that we tested. We tested several metaphors, and we're working out strategies for helping advocates communicate more effectively about a social issue. We test lots of different ways that could be done, and then when we identify which one does it most effectively, that's the one we bring to you and talk to you about and help you use. So in this case, the metaphor that works here to help widen that lens and build public understanding is the metaphor of boiling over. So here's where you get to use all of those great words that you came up with, words and images and associations that you came up with earlier during our brainstorm. So the idea is we can think about the issue of adolescent substance use as a pot boiling over. What we want to communicate is there's kind of a process of heating up, and that at a certain point things spill over and become much, much worse. So one of the kind of features of this metaphor that makes it particularly effective is there's a whole scenario here. We've set up a context, right? Like there's a stove, there's a pot, there's a process that's unfolding. We also can see how we can intervene. This is not an inevitable process. It's not predetermined how this scenario will go. In fact, if we're aware that a process is unfolding, we can think about ways to intervene, disrupt that process, cool things down, and sort of take charge and feel some agency in determining how this story will end. So it's a really effective framing tool for helping members of the public think about adolescent substance use not just as the result of teens acting in reckless ways, but as a social issue that we can all be a part of thinking about prevention of, and thinking about, so prevention in the sense of, turning down the heat before the pot boils over, and offering interventions when they're needed, recognizing that they're needed, and coming up with strong interventions that are appropriate. Here's an example. I just want to give you a reframe because sometimes it can be helpful to see kind of how a metaphor works in action, how an unframed piece of comms or a pre-framed piece of communications can be reframed in a way that utilizes this metaphor as a tool. So take just a second to read the little blurb you have on the left-hand side of your screen. Okay, now here's the reframed version. We're using the metaphor of boiling over. See if you can identify what words in this second blurb, in this reframed excerpt, conjure up the metaphor of boiling over. What words stand out to you? You can go ahead and type them in the chat box. Did we get any comments in the chat box, Rose?
Yeah, we've got some about boiling over, temperature low, heat down, and simmer.
Great. So you identified all the ones that I identified in here. And you can see how this metaphor helps. It pulls focus away from teens, from the kind of the subset of the population that we all get is implicated here. And it foregrounds collective action. We're talking about not just the actions of schools, but the fact that schools are playing a part, which implies we all have a part to play in this. We're talking about adolescent substance use as a health issue. Health is something universal. Health implications are things that we all experience, that we all share. There's a context now in which a scenario plays out, but that the results of that scenario can be altered if we're acting together to change them. Okay, and here's another quick example. This is just how framing can work in small spaces too, how a tweet can be reframed. So here we have, when teens are lured into trying drugs, the consequences can be lifelong. And then this website gives us lots to think about. Here's that same message reframed with the metaphor of boiling over. Now we have Youth drug use is like a kettle on the stove. It won't boil over if we turn down the gas. This website suggests how to lower the temperature in our country. And the idea here is if lots of different folks, advocates who are talking about adolescent substance use, use this terminology, we'll be able to change the stories in progress. We'll be able to change how we kind of collectively understand the social issue of adolescent substance use. Okay, one more example. I'm going to move a little bit more quickly through this one, but we've got one more social issue to talk about and a particular tool for widening the lens on that issue. In this case, we're talking about children's outcomes, youth outcomes. So the place to start in terms of those stories that are in progress is that for most of the public, we kind of think basically kids turn out fine. In instances where there are challenges or there are poor outcomes, those are the exception. We're not thinking about those as much, and we're kind of relegating those to the sidelines. There's also kind of a sense that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. So a certain amount of stress in kids' lives is actually healthy. You know, it teaches you that life is hard and prepares you for what comes later on. The thing that is most credited with a child's outcomes is that child's individual willpower, their kind of just steadfast determination, their willingness to do what's required, to bounce back after difficult circumstances and just choose to be successful and work as hard as is required to get there. So it's a way of thinking about resilience as, first of all, an individual level attribute. And there's kind of a sense among the public that resilience is something innate. It's not something that changes over time or that can be kind of built or broken down. It's something that is in all of us, and those of us that choose to use it to draw on our resilience are the ones that are more likely to succeed. So this kind of individual accountability that you see reflected in lots of these stories in progress is expanded just a little bit in the case of the story of the family bubble. So when we're talking about children and youth, there is accountability placed on other family members as well. But it still remains a family bubble. So we're not, in this case, thinking about, for example, what stressors are put on parents or how kind of the challenges and multiple burdens that caretakers often have to deal with and how those are influenced by the social context. We're thinking about how youth outcomes are attributed to the individual child, himself or herself, and that child's parents who have a responsibility to ensure that that child has good outcomes. And then lastly, there's the idea that some kids go through severe trauma. They suffer significant damage, and in those cases, there's not a lot we can do. Damage done is damage done. There's not a lot of public understanding about how individual outcomes play out over time and how they can be changed and engaged with and how supports are actually needed at every step along the way and can improve outcomes whenever they take place. We shouldn't be giving up on anyone, but that's not an idea that is particularly strong in the public mind. So again, our task is to build public understanding of how social context and environmental conditions shape children's outcomes. And because what we need to do is offer some explanation, building understanding requires explanation, again, we're going to turn to the metaphor as an explanatory tool. In this case, the metaphor is of a resilience scale. It offers a new way to think about this concept of resilience. So the idea is that child outcomes reflect kind of the balance of two different sides of the scale. On one side of the scale, there are the challenges, the sources of trauma or adversity or difficult kind of risks and negative influences in a child's life. And on the other side of the scale are all of the supports available to that child. Nurturing relationships with adults, community programming, all the things that help children to thrive. And actually resilience is a reflection of all the different things that are loaded onto that scale and how the positive protective factors are able to outweigh or not the harmful ones on the other side. So in this case, I'm going to show you a short video clip. This is the last one I have to share. Okay, I'll cue that up again. It's a video that helps, that kind of shows this metaphor in action. It describes how the metaphor works, what it helps to convey, and then you can kind of take from it ideas about how you might incorporate the different aspects of this metaphor into your own communications. The last thing I'll say, and you'll be able to see this in the video clip, is that you can talk about the kind of protective factors and risk factors on either side of the scale and leave it at that. That's a really useful explanatory tool in itself. If you want to go a little bit deeper and offer kind of an extended explanation about how biology factors into a child's resilience, because biology is part of the equation here. And in particular, if you want to go even deeper than that and talk about things like epigenetics and the relationship between biological and social factors, you can talk about the fulcrum of the scale as representing that, representing the genetic makeup of the child and the aspects of a child's kind of DNA, biological makeup, and the role that plays in their lives and in their outcomes. So here is this metaphor in action, so you can see how it works.
You can think of child development as a scale that has two sides. A child's scale is placed in a community and has spaces on either side where experiences and environmental influences stack up over the course of development. One side gets stacked with negative factors like stress, violence, and neglect, while the other side gets loaded with positive factors like supportive relationships, skill-building opportunities, and community resources. In the same way that the weight on a teeter-totter affects the direction it tips, the factors that a child is exposed to affect how they turn out, the outcomes of their development. But the way the scale tips and the outcomes a child experiences are also a function of the position of the scale's fulcrum, which is like the genetic makeup of the child. The position of the fulcrum affects how the scale responds to factors that get stacked on either side and how easily it tips. We know that fulcrums start in different places for different children, and that this genetic starting point is an important factor in how a child responds to experiences and how they turn out. We also know that the position of the fulcrum isn't fixed. It's a sliding set point. Over time, the things that load and tip the scale can actually shift the position of the fulcrum. There are points in human development when this fulcrum is easier to shift. During these shiftable periods, our biology can be changed, making us more or less able to withstand negative weight that gets stacked on the scale. One of these shiftable periods is early childhood, and another is adolescence. That's why it's so important to make sure that children have positive experiences, especially early on, and to continue positive supports throughout development. By providing positive experiences during these sensitive periods of development and offloading negative weight, we can shift the fulcrum, making children more able to bear the weight of negative experiences later on, making them more resilient. So resilience isn't just about individual children. It's about the environments and experiences that get stacked on the resilience scale. Resilient societies are those that figure out how to stack more positives than negatives onto the children who will become workers and citizens.
So that video was created by some of our illustrators here at Frameworks in conjunction with several of our partner groups that you just saw listed. And obviously there are lots of different kind of aspects to that resilience scale metaphor, and you can pick the pieces of it that work as the tools that you need in your own communications. You don't have to walk through every piece of that metaphor. You can use the parts that help you communicate whatever it is about the issue of child outcomes that you're wanting to communicate. So here's an example of how you can take an existing piece of communication and reframe it using that metaphor. Take a minute to read what's on the screen. Okay, now we have the reframed version, and we are reframing it with the metaphor of resilience scale. As you read, see if you can pick up on the language that is kind of, that's utilizing the metaphor, utilizing the different entailments of this idea of a resilience scale. And when you come across them, type those into the chat box. What do you think, Rose? Is anything coming in?
Yep, we've got a few. We've got tipping the scale, stacking up, offloading. That looks like it. Oh, and balance, or tipping the balance, actually.
Yeah, great. Excellent. Okay. So this metaphor has helped us it's helped us think about the bigger picture, right? We're thinking about all the different types of influences that can affect children's outcomes. And we're also seeing how lots of those are structural. Lots of them have implications for all of us. You know, we all benefit from the kinds of supports that help our children develop well. So to kind of sum up the different strategies that we've talked through over the course of the webinar, we've got a list of things to avoid, or to avoid queuing up in your communications, and then a list of things to advance. So they kind of serve as reminders of how to tell those, the kinds of stories that will lead to public engagement and public understanding of the issues that you're talking about. So as much as you can, avoid individual behaviors or experiences as the focus of your message. But instead talk about them within the context that give understanding to how those individuals made the decisions they did in the first place. Avoid focusing on who's affected by an issue, and instead focus on who's responsible for resolving the issue, who can make a difference here. That's a much bigger pool of folks than just the group that feels the effects most significantly. Avoid the man in a hole story. It is compelling, but it doesn't have the effects that we want to create social change and to build understanding. Instead, tell a how it works story. So bring in more of the environment and context. Avoid a vivid case study or anecdotes. Even though they tug at heartstrings, it's much more effective to offer compelling evidence of the broader system, offering details that fit into a bigger picture that help us see kind of everything at play, all the different actors that are involved. And then avoid just talking about what needs to be improved, and instead talk about how we can do that, how we can make improvements that are needed, and how we can work together to do that, so that we're all brought into the story. We're all kind of encouraged to feel a sense of efficacy that we can contribute to this. We're affected by it, and we're all invested in doing something to make it better. So lastly, I just want to encourage you to think about the stories that you're currently telling, or maybe just the stories that you know are told frequently in your field. Sometimes they are individual stories in terms of being about specific kind of prominent people, well-known people whose names are kind of circulated often. But maybe it's just that you kind of recognize that shape, that man in a hole story, and maybe you can think of times when you've told it or when you've heard them about issues related to your field. So what can you identify that's missing from those stories? What are the stories that are being told, and what are the kind of contextual factors that are often missing from them? Think for a minute and see if you can think of any specific examples and share them with the rest of us to kind of give some specific relevance to the actual work that you all are doing currently.
So there's one really interesting one here Pam mentioned. The one I would like to dispel is the apple does not fall far from the tree when talking about parents of youth.
Yeah, that's a great one. I mean, you can see how, so we talked through some of those stories in progress, and that's a big one. It's kind of a manifestation of that family bubble story, right? Like we can see parents are responsible, and we see kids' outcomes or kids' actions as a result of what their parents do, but there's something really deterministic about thinking about the issue that way, and it kind of, first of all, it absolves the rest of us. We're all off the hook. If I make good decisions about my own parenting, then these broader social issues we're talking about really don't implicate me. But if we recognize that it's more than just relationships between parents and children that matters here, there are broader contexts at work. We recognize that we all play a role in these issues. We all need to care about them. And also that, it's not predetermined what a child's outcomes will be based on the specific actions of their parents. In fact, there are lots of other things that weigh into that picture. That's a good opportunity to talk about, to use the metaphor of resilience scale and talk about all the other protective factors that could be available to that child.
Yeah, and Pam had actually mentioned in here, I could see how the resilience scale would help with the apple story.
Nice one, Pam. Yeah, you did that work yourself. That's terrific.
Yeah, we've got others. People tell stories of successes, but not stories of where systems failed. Youth and families. Another comment, the story of the system often does not get told. I would love to know what metaphors may help us explain systems of care to the broader community. We've got a second for that request.
Great. Okay, so I'm glad to hear those requests because that is the focus of the fourth and final webinar in this series. Jen Nichols, who lots of you met, those of you who were on the last webinar got to meet Jen, and she's going to talk through strategies for talking about systems of care specifically when we meet next time. In fact, that's a kind of a good segue. Just wanted to put up a reminder for when that next webinar is. It's Tuesday, June 4th, and it's the same time, 3 to 4:30 p.m. Eastern. Just as we've done in the past, we have a framing challenge for you to do between now and that next webinar. So the challenge is to reframe a story you've written previously or come across if you can't think of one that you've authored yourself, and think about how you could reframe it to include more of the important context, how you can bring more of the system into view in the ways that we've been talking about on this webinar. And then think about how if the story you want to tell happens to be about adolescent substance use, consider using the metaphor of boiling over. And if it happens to be about child development, youth outcomes, think about how you might draw on the metaphor of resilience scale to help bring in that broader context. So on the next webinar, we'll share your thoughts, how you've kind of gone about tackling this challenge, maybe some questions that came up in the process. And now I want to turn to doing that for last webinar's challenge, and just see for any of you that took on the challenge and maybe have some questions or just want to share what you were able to do, the progress you made, so we can all kind of celebrate that work that you did. I would invite you to share what you came up with when you worked on that challenge. So just as a reminder, the challenge last time was to identify an unhelpful framing cue in your communications. So that could be, kind of fostering a sense of urgency if you identified crisis framing in your message. Maybe it was reporting a statistic without sufficient kind of interpretation and a clear message to accompany that statistic. So does anyone have is anyone willing to share how they went about working on that challenge and want to talk through maybe just what it was like for you, how it went, and anything else you want to share?
One thing I hadn't mentioned that Michael mentioned a little while ago is that he recognizes the man in the hole stories from his organization without an aerial view solution attached to it, which is kind of applying today's lesson to last month's challenge. Though I guess there is still a question of how you get to that place where you're kind of talking about the aerial view, the contextualization of how we can work toward a solution together. Maybe that's one way to co-opt last month's challenge for this week's, this month's content.
2 challenges in one.
Yeah.
That is kind of I think that's a good way to summarize 2 big aspects of framing. So one is figuring out what's unhelpful, figuring out how your communications can kind of cue up unproductive ways of thinking, and then knowing how to reframe that, knowing how to avoid those things, and instead draw on useful, tested and proven tools to achieve the things that you want your communications to achieve. Both of those are critical tasks, avoiding and advancing. So maybe what we can do is just kind of broaden our discussion and open it up for any questions that you have, anything that you're thinking about. We've covered a lot today, but I'm eager to hear from you what you'd like to discuss in a bit more detail, or what you could use some more clarification on. So feel free to use the chat box. We'll give you a minute to come up with some and chat some more.
This is Michelle Boardman back again. While we're waiting we've got a few comments here, which I'm sure Rose will pick up, but while we're waiting for folks to contribute, I have some great news. You may have received an email, and if you haven't, certainly reach out to me. We'll make sure you get the information. The TA Network is offering each state a subscription to the Frameworks Academy, where you can use all of their online tools to work through some of the concepts presented in these webinars and develop your own messaging. And so that is available for free, and the subscription will be open for a year. And we're offering one per state. So we've reached out to people in each state and invited them to share with us how they would use it. There are a few people on today's webinar participating who've taken us up on that. But if you'd like to hear more, please reach out. We'd love to share the information with you. And it'd be a great way to put this information into use.
And we do have a great question. I'll read it verbatim because I really like the way you put this. It's not to step on the next webinar's toes, but do you have any ideas of how people might think up some metaphors on their own that might better explain their work?
Whoa, that's a great question, and actually a question that I get a fair amount because metaphor is something that we all use in our communication. It's kind of a device that even without thinking, we pull on metaphors to kind of translate concepts that we want to be able to more effectively communicate. It's sort of a natural thing we do. Do you have anything to add, Rose?
Yeah. I mean, so this is something we do on the research team, and we actually get together for each project to really dig into all possible metaphors and kind of work out what might work and what might not. And some of the biggest, I can maybe tell you the biggest traps we tend to fall into, and then if you're coming up with metaphors that avoid those traps, you have a sense that you're on the right track. But one thing that's actually really tricky is making sure that for each thing so if we're talking about, we'll use boiling over as the example, that boiling over and the issue it's describing, substance abuse, that they actually connect to each other. So if the boiling over is sort of like uncontrolled or sort of problematic substance abuse, you want to make sure that then someone might ask, like, well, what is the pot? Can you come up with a reasonable thing in the idea of what a pot would be? If it makes no sense whatsoever, you're kind of what we call not mapping very well the two domains to each other. So actually, like, drawing out how one domain maps onto another can be really helpful. And that sort of tells you that you're actually explaining the thing you're trying to explain and not something else. And then the other one that we actually do is we kind of often do a sort of like privilege check on our metaphors because Sometimes, we're of course operating with our own stories about what makes sense and how the world works, and so we might come in with a metaphor that we realize is not even appropriate for the audience we want it to be for or about. So sometimes we've talked about, what was the one that was not right? Well, we've criticized our own sailing metaphor a little bit as not being exactly the most inclusive metaphor. So you can kind of stop and ask yourself, is this something that people should kind of somewhat universally have experience with or access to, or is this something that might really represent one group, which we don't want to do? So I think those are the two biggest concerns that we tend to have, is that sort of mapping part to part and the sort of appropriateness and inclusivity of the metaphor content, if that makes sense.
I think that's a really useful point to make, Rose, which is that sometimes metaphors fail badly, and sometimes because they're kind of shortcuts, because they're devices that do a lot of explanatory work of themselves. If it's not the right metaphor, if it doesn't kind of map onto the domain the way Rose just described, it can actually explain the issue in a way that is really detrimental, or either confusing, or in a way that kind of cues up exactly those unproductive cultural models that we're wanting to push into the background. So we advise against using untested metaphors, just because we aren't able to say that those work effectively, that they do the specific job that you're wanting to do. It's exactly why we always test metaphors before you recommend them, because it's an aid, but it's also it's a powerful tool. You want to know that you're using the right one and that you're able to use it in the way that that brings about the results that you're looking for.
Yeah, and there's another metaphor in here, because Pam asked, or said, we use secret sauce to describe family support partners. Is that a metaphor? And I would say certainly, because they aren't literally sauce. And so that is a good test. It's a really interesting one, I think. You have to think more about how that works and what it opens up for people. My only question would be with the idea of the secret part, and whether you actually want it to be suggested that there's something secret in this. But the sauce is cool because it suggests that it's really a crucial ingredient in making something, fruitful and maybe wholesome or something like that. And maybe that's what family support partners are actually doing. We play around with cooking metaphors a lot, actually. So that's a really interesting. Oh, and she said we could call it the special sauce. Yeah, that might do a similar thing. It's often, as Jess said, hard to know without testing these, but that's a fun one.
You all are getting a real treat here, because you're kind of getting some insight into the thinking of the research team. I feel like this is a treat for me too. So I'm on the team that does the trainings and kind of translates the research for folks like you all, and Rose is on the team that does. She sort of gave us a peek into some of the theorizing that the research team does about. They've got a lot of past experience at this point to help kind of inform how they think about what is likely to work, or how, or even being able to predict where particular metaphors will go wrong. They do the mapping exercises that Rose described, and but then those theories, which are really well developed by our awesome research team, go through a rigorous testing process as well, that they also design for the very reason that that we can't predict every aspect about how they'll play, and being able to collect empirical information, put them to the test and use them in communications with members of the public and see how they're interpreted, how they affect thinking, how they, what frame effects they have, is really important for that reason. This is fun for me too. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks, Rose.
Yeah, I was just thinking about how complicated humans and human systems are, and that's why we have this work, and that's why I'm sure you're all doing the work that you are, but it's because we can't predict everything, and things change, and there are always nuances to be accounted for, and so, yeah, it kind of goes back to what you're saying about why we need to test things out.
Yeah. Explanation is a really important communications tool, and a heavy lift too, because there's so many complications in the world to be explained. Any Any last-minute questions? We've got just a few minutes remaining. Any other thoughts or comments or things you want to discuss a bit more?
We have one coming in.
Okay. Was there an earlier point of...
Yeah, there was an earlier point when we were thinking about last month's task about reframing communications, because Michael mentioned I've been catching myself and how I might put a data point first without any more context, or using the wrong value, especially for stories we wrote recently on the Institute website of how mental health organizations are celebrating Children's Mental Health Awareness Day. It's pretty interesting because it's like almost like insider communications maybe in that case, where it's about organizations and stuff, but the data points and the values it's just helpful to become mindful, I think, of how and when you're using those things.
Definitely. That's a good way to put it. I think recognizing, for example, recognizing that you're using unframed statistics is half the battle.
Mm-hmm. Or more.
Or more, yeah. Exactly.
It's hard.
It's a good kind of prompt to just kind of in your own mind to think, what is the takeaway here? Like, what, in a nutshell, what is the message? What is it I want people to get from this whole piece? I think sometimes we use statistics to do that for us. We kind of want to do a mic drop after we put out some kind of statistic that really has powerful meaning for us. But if you aren't actually stating that takeaway explicitly, there's a real risk of it being a mic drop moment for other folks, but with a different message, which is obviously not what you want. You don't want to hand over control of the message itself. So, any other questions?
Jess and Rose, I want to thank you both so much for an incredible presentation today. It really gave me a lot to think about. I've been a big proponent of the single person story, and I can see now how I could be a lot more effective. So I really appreciate that. And thank you, everyone, for taking time in the middle of National Children's Mental Health Awareness Week. I know you're all very busy. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you on the next webinar. And again, please keep an eye out for the immediate pop-up of the survey, because we'd love to hear from you. Thank you, and have a great rest of the day.
Thanks for joining, everyone.
Bye.